At 11:43 p.m. inside a county hospital in Texas, the fluorescent lights hummed softly above nearly empty hallways. The night shift had settled into that uneasy quiet that only hospitals know, the kind that feels temporary, fragile, as if something could shatter it at any moment. In one of those hallways stood a woman who had been awake for almost 38 hours. Her name was Patricia Walker. She leaned her back against the cold wall of the emergency department, closed her eyes for just a second, and tried to remember what it felt like to be rested, to feel human again. Her legs trembled beneath her, her shoulders burned, her hands that had saved lives for nearly 3 decades, felt heavy, almost numb. Patricia was an ER nurse. She had been one for 28 years. And that night, she was running on nothing but muscle memory and faith. Just hours earlier, she had assisted in a brutal car accident. Blood, shattered glass, screaming monitors. The patient survived. The surgeon called it a success. Everyone moved on. Everyone except Patricia. Because while she helped strangers fight for their lives every night, her own life felt like it was slowly collapsing, piece by piece. Her husband had died years ago. Her children lived far away now. Her mother was losing her memories, and might not survive without a surgery Patricia couldn't afford. And still, she showed up, because that's what nurses do. She opened her eyes when she heard raised voices near the emergency desk. A familiar sound. Another confrontation. Another person being told no. Patricia didn't know it yet, but in just a few minutes, she would make a decision that would cost her everything she had left, and give her something she never believed she'd see again. Hope. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from right now? What city? What country? And what time is it where you are? Let us know in the comments. And if stories of faith, compassion, and quiet miracles speak to your heart, consider subscribing to Heaven Walks With Us. You're not here by accident. Because this story isn't just about a tired nurse, it's about a night when compassion collided with a broken system. A night when a woman gave what little she had left to a patient who, according to hospital records, never existed. And yet, by morning, nothing in her life would ever be the same again. Let me tell you what happened next. Patricia Walker had learned long ago how to work while exhausted. Not the ordinary kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the deep, bone-heavy exhaustion that settles in after years of giving more than you have. The kind that makes time blur and turns entire shifts into a haze of alarms, footsteps, and half-remembered conversations. She had been an emergency room nurse for 28 years. 28 years of night shifts and double shifts. 28 years of blood on white shoes that never quite came clean. 28 years of holding hands while families cried, of whispering reassurance while monitors screamed, of standing between life and death more times than she could count. That night was no different, except that her body was finally starting to rebel. Her legs shook when she stood too long. Her lower back burned with a dull, constant ache. Her temples throbbed from too much coffee and not enough sleep. She had arrived at the hospital the previous morning for a normal 8-hour shift, but the overnight nurse had called in sick. Then the morning replacement never showed up. Patricia, being the most experienced nurse on staff, had stayed. Again and again. Now the clock said she had been awake for nearly 38 hours. Her once crisp blue scrubs were stained and wrinkled, dried blood on the sleeve, something else she didn't want to identify near the hem. Her hair, usually pulled into a tight bun, had slipped loose in tired strands that clung to her damp forehead. Dark circles sat heavily beneath her eyes, so deep they made her look far older than her 52 years. But the physical exhaustion was only part of it. What weighed on Patricia most couldn't be measured in hours or shifts. It was the quiet grief she carried into every room, the grief of a woman who had lost her husband suddenly, without warning, The grief of children growing up and moving far away, building lives she only glimpsed through phone calls and holiday photos. The grief of watching her own mother slowly disappear, piece by piece, into confusion and fear. There were moments, standing alone in supply closets or empty corridors, when Patricia wondered how much longer she could keep doing this, not nursing, life. She had always believed that if you worked hard enough, if you showed up, if you did the right thing, even when it was difficult, things would somehow balance out. But lately, it felt like the harder she worked, the deeper the hole became. She took a slow breath and pressed her palm against the wall, grounding herself. Just get through the night, she told herself, just a few more hours, because people were still coming through those doors. People were still bleeding, still hurting, still afraid. And no matter how tired she was, no matter how empty she felt, Patricia Walker had never learned how to walk away from someone in need. She didn't know it yet. But the very exhaustion that night threatened to break her was about to place her exactly where she needed to be. For Patricia Walker, the hospital was only half of the weight she carried. The other half waited for her every morning at home. 7 years earlier, her life had split cleanly in two. One moment, her husband Michael was standing in their small kitchen, joking about burnt toast and asking if she wanted coffee. The next, he was on the floor, his face pale, his eyes unfocused, his hand slipping from hers as paramedics rushed in too late. A massive heart attack, 56 years old, gone before she could even understand what was happening. Michael had been the steady one, the calm one, the man who balanced her intensity with quiet reassurance. When he died, Patricia didn't just lose her husband. She lost the person who carried half the emotional load of their lives. After the funeral, people told her she was strong. They said it as a compliment. But strength, Patricia learned, wasn't something you felt. It was something you performed day after day because there was no other choice. Their 2 children had grown up and moved away not long after, one to Colorado, the other to North Carolina. They called when they could, sent photos, promised to visit soon. But life was busy, and distance has a way of turning love into something that exists mostly in memory. Patricia understood. Still, the house felt emptier every year. And then there was her mother, Eleanor Walker, 79 years old. 3 years ago, the forgetfulness had started gently, lost keys, repeated questions, misplaced words. Patricia told herself it was normal aging. She wanted to believe that. But it didn't stay gentle. Now, some mornings, Eleanor didn't recognize her own daughter. She called Patricia by her sister's name, a sister who had died decades earlier. She asked when her husband was coming home, unaware that he had been buried 20 years ago. Once, Patricia came home from a night shift to find the front door open, and her mother wandering down the street in her slippers, confused and terrified. That was the moment Patricia knew she couldn't leave her alone anymore. She hired a part-time caregiver, then full-time. Every week the cost dug deeper into money Patricia didn't have. Her credit cards crept toward their limits, first for groceries, then prescriptions, then utilities. The mortgage payment loomed every month like a quiet threat. She paid the minimums, then less, then late. She stopped checking the balances. Some nights, lying awake after shifts like this one, Patricia would stare at the ceiling and do the math in her head. If my mother needs long-term care, if I miss even one paycheck, if something goes wrong, the numbers never worked. And now, this week, the doctor had delivered the news she feared most. A dangerous clot, a high risk of stroke, surgery needed immediately. Without it, her mother might not survive. With it, Patricia had no idea how she would pay. She hadn't told anyone at work. Nurses learned to compartmentalize, to leave their personal lives outside patient rooms, to be the calm one while everything else falls apart. But that night, standing alone in the ER hallway, Patricia felt the walls closing in. She had spent her entire life caring for others. And now, when she needed help the most, she didn't know where it would come from. She took another breath, squared her shoulders, and turned back toward the emergency desk. Because no matter what was waiting at home, patients were still walking through those doors. And Patricia Walker had never been the kind of woman who looked away. The call had come 3 days earlier, in the middle of a short, restless sleep. Patricia had been lying on top of the covers, still in her scrubs, when her phone began to vibrate on the nightstand. She answered it without even opening her eyes. "Mrs. Walker?" the voice asked gently. "Yes," Patricia replied, already sitting up. Nurses learned to recognize that tone. It was the neurologist. He spoke carefully, choosing his words the way doctors do when they know what they're about to say will change someone's life. The scans showed a growing blood clot. The risk of a stroke was high, unpredictable, dangerous. Her mother needed surgery, not eventually, not someday, soon. Without it, there was no guarantee Eleanor would survive the next few weeks. And even if she did, the damage could leave her trapped, alive, but lost inside her own body. Patricia thanked him, wrote down what little she could process, and hung up the phone. Then she sat there in the dark, holding the device in both hands as the reality settled in. The surgery wasn't fully covered. The deductible alone was more than she had ever held in her bank account at one time. The remaining costs would follow her for years. She went to the bank the next morning. She dressed carefully, brought documents, pay stubs, medical letters. She explained everything, her job, her years of service, her mother's condition. The loan officer listened politely, typed quietly, nodded without looking at her. Then he shook his head. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Walker," he said. "Your debt-to-income ratio is too high. We can't approve this," Patricia begged. She hated that part, the way desperation stripped dignity away. She promised extra shifts, overtime, anything, but policies don't bend for tears. She walked out of the bank feeling as if someone had quietly closed a door behind her and locked it. That was when the anger came, not loud anger, the quiet kind, the kind that sits heavy in your chest and whispers questions you don't want to ask. Why keep showing up? Why keep giving everything when it's never enough? Why does doing the right thing always seem to cost so much? That night, back at the hospital, Patricia leaned against the same cold wall she always did. She looked up at the stained ceiling tiles and whispered a prayer she wasn't sure anyone was listening to. "God, I know I haven't talked to you much lately," she said softly. "I know I've been angry. But I don't know how to do this anymore." Her voice cracked. "I just need a little strength, just enough to keep going." There was no answer, only the hum of fluorescent lights, only the distant beeping of monitors. Patricia wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and pushed herself away from the wall, because the emergency room doors were opening again, and whatever was breaking inside her, there were still lives waiting on the other side. The emergency doors burst open just before midnight. Paramedics rushed in, shouting vitals over one another as they pushed a gurney soaked in rain and blood. A young woman, no older than 25, was crying out in pain, her arm twisted at an unnatural angle. The sharp smell of gasoline and wet asphalt clung to her clothes. "Trauma bay now," someone shouted. Patricia moved without thinking. Her exhaustion disappeared beneath instinct, hands steady, voice calm. She cut fabric, applied pressure, passed instruments, followed orders. Years of experience guided her movements, even while her mind screamed for rest. For nearly an hour, the ER was chaos. Monitors screaming, shoes slipping on wet floors, doctors barking commands that blurred together. Then, slowly, the storm passed. The patient stabilized. The doors closed. The noise faded. At 12:47 a.m., the emergency department fell into an uneasy quiet. Patricia peeled off her gloves and leaned against the counter, breathing hard. Just a few more hours, she told herself. Just get through the night. That was when she heard raised voices near the front desk. "Sir, I already told you, this isn't going to happen." Patricia glanced up. At the registration counter stood Kara, the overnight intake clerk. She was efficient, sharp, and known for following protocol to the letter. In front of her was a man Patricia hadn't noticed before. He stood awkwardly, shoulders slumped, rainwater pooling beneath his bare feet. His clothes were torn and dirty, clinging to him as if he'd been sleeping outside. His long dark hair was matted, his face streaked with grime and old blood. "I just need someone to clean my hands," the man said quietly. "They're bleeding." Kara barely looked at him. "Do you have insurance?" she asked. "No," he replied. "An ID?" The man shook his head. "Then I can't register you," Kara said flatly. "No insurance, no ID, no treatment. That's hospital policy." "But please," the man said. He raised his hand slightly, and Patricia saw the dark red stains seeping through the cloth wrapped around them. "I've been turned away already. I'm in a lot of pain." Kara sighed, irritation flashing across her face. "This is an emergency department, not a charity clinic," she said. "You're going to have to leave before you contaminate the floor. Security can escort you out if needed." The words hit Patricia like a punch to the chest. She had seen this scene before, too many times. People turned away not because they weren't sick, but because they weren't insured, because they couldn't pay, because they didn't fit neatly into the system. The man lowered his hands slowly. For a moment, it looked like he might say something else. Then he simply nodded and turned to leave. Something twisted deep inside Patricia's stomach, because she knew exactly what that walk looked like. It was the walk of someone who had run out of places to ask for help. And for the first time that night, Patricia felt something stronger than exhaustion. She felt the quiet pull of a decision she could no longer avoid. Patricia watched the man take 2 slow steps away from the registration desk. He moved carefully, as if every shift of weight sent pain shooting through his body. His shoulders were rounded, not in anger, not in defiance, but in something far more familiar: defeat. That was when Patricia really saw him, not just the dirt on his clothes or the dried blood on his face, but the way his eyes avoided everyone else in the room, the way he had learned, perhaps over many years, to make himself smaller, less noticeable, less inconvenient. The cloth around his hands had been wrapped hastily, probably torn from an old shirt. It was soaked through now, dark red spreading across the fabric. Thin lines of blood trailed down his wrists and dripped onto the white tile floor. Bare feet, cut, bruised, cold. Patricia's chest tightened. She had treated construction workers, assault victims, burn patients, people pulled from wreckage and rubble. But something about this man felt different, not louder, not more dramatic, quieter. As he turned slightly, she noticed a deep cut along his forehead, already crusted over. His lower lip was split. One side of his rib cage rose more slowly than the other when he breathed. He had been hurt, badly. "Sir," Patricia heard herself say. The man paused and looked back. Up close, she guessed he might have been in his late 30s, or maybe his 40s. It was hard to tell. His face carried a weariness that didn't belong to any particular age. His eyes were dark, steady, and strangely gentle. "Yes," he said softly. There was no accusation in his voice, no bitterness, just pain, held carefully. Patricia glanced toward the trauma bays. The doctors were occupied. The nurses were busy. No one was watching. She lowered her voice. "What happened to your hands?" she asked. The man looked down at them, almost as if he had forgotten they were there. "It was a misunderstanding," he said after a moment. "Some people don't like what I represent. Sometimes they respond with violence." Patricia frowned. "Were you attacked?" He considered the question. "Yes," he said simply, "but I forgive them." The words caught her off guard. Most patients were angry, afraid, demanding. This man was none of those things. "Does it hurt?" she asked. He nodded slightly. very much." Something in the way he said it, without complaint, without drama, sent a quiet chill through her. Patricia felt the familiar tug of professional instinct, and something else, something older than training, older than policy. She looked at his bleeding hands again. Then, at the exit doors, he was clearly being pushed toward. And in that moment, Patricia Walker understood something with unsettling clarity. If she let him walk out now, she would never forget it. She took a breath and made up her mind. Patricia didn't announce her decision. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't call a doctor. She didn't ask for permission. She simply stepped forward. "I'll take him," she said quietly. The words surprised even her. Kara looked up from the computer, eyes narrowing. "Take him where?" "To an exam room," Patricia replied. Her voice was steady now. "I'll clean his wounds and bandage them." "You can't do that," Kara said sharply. "He's not registered. There's no chart, no insurance." "I know." "You could get written up," Kara warned, "or worse." Patricia held her gaze. "Then write me up." For a long second, the two women stared at each other, the system on one side, compassion on the other. Finally, Patricia turned to the man. "Come with me," she said gently. The man hesitated. "I don't want to cause trouble." "You're not," she said. "You're hurt." She led him down a quiet hallway toward the far end of the emergency department, where an old exam room sat mostly unused. The lights flickered slightly as she pushed the door open. As he stepped inside, Patricia felt the weight of what she was doing settle fully on her shoulders. This wasn't a small rule she was breaking. This was a line. Hospital policy existed for reasons: liability, funding, protection. She understood that better than most, but she also understood something else. Rules were made by people, and people sometimes forgot why the rules existed in the first place. She closed the door behind them. In the sudden quiet of the room, Patricia became acutely aware of her own exhaustion. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for gloves. Her heart pounded, not from fear of the man, but from the consequences waiting outside that door. If administration found out, she could lose her job, her income, her insurance, everything her mother depended on. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. What am I doing? I can't afford this. I can't afford to be brave tonight. Then she looked at the man again, at the way he stood patiently, hands bleeding, saying nothing, asking for nothing more than mercy. And something inside Patricia hardened into resolve. She had spent her life caring for strangers. She had watched systems fail people again and again. She had followed rules even when they felt wrong, but not tonight, not this time. She pulled on her gloves, met the man's eyes, and spoke with quiet certainty. "Sit down," she said. "Let me see your hands." And with that simple act, Patricia Walker crossed a line she could never uncross, a line that would cost her more than she imagined, and give her far more than she believed possible. The man sat slowly on the edge of the exam table, careful not to put too much weight on his hands. Every movement caused a quiet intake of breath, a small, controlled sound, as if he had learned long ago how to endure pain without letting it escape. Patricia turned on the overhead light. It flooded the small room with harsh white brightness, revealing details she hadn't fully seen in the hallway. She reached gently for the cloth wrapped around his right hand. "I need to unwrap these," she said softly. "It's going to hurt." "I know," he replied. "It's all right." She hesitated for just a moment, then began to loosen the makeshift bandage. What she saw made her stop breathing. The wound wasn't a clean cut. It wasn't the kind of injury caused by glass or a blade. The skin at the center of his palm was torn inward, raw and swollen, as if something thick and blunt had been driven straight through. The surrounding flesh was bruised and inflamed, already showing signs of infection. Patricia swallowed hard. She had seen thousands of injuries in her career, but this one felt deliberate. She moved to his left hand. It was the same. 2 wounds, nearly identical, centered in the palms. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the saline solution. "God," she whispered before she could stop herself. The man said nothing. Patricia poured the saline slowly, watching dried blood and dirt wash away, revealing the full extent of the damage. The man's body tensed, his jaw tightened. But he didn't cry out. He didn't pull away. He simply closed his eyes and breathed, steady, controlled, accepting. "You should have pain medication," Patricia said quietly, "at least a local anesthetic." "I've known worse pain," he replied. "This I can bear." The words sent an unexpected chill through her. She cleaned the wounds carefully, methodically, just as she had done countless times before. But tonight, every movement felt heavier, more meaningful, as if this wasn't just a medical task, but something closer to a ritual. As she worked, she noticed something else. There was no anger in him, no resentment, no bitterness, only a deep, quiet sadness, layered with something else she couldn't quite name. Compassion, perhaps. "Who did this to you?" she asked gently. The man opened his eyes. "People who were afraid," he said after a moment. "People who believed hurting me would make them feel safer." "That's not right," Patricia said. "No one deserves this." He looked at her then, really looked at her. "Everyone deserves love," he said, "even those who don't know how to give it." Patricia felt tears sting the corners of her eyes. She had spent years watching cruelty harden people, watching pain turn into rage, watching victims become bitter. But this man carried none of that. She applied antiseptic. He flinched slightly, then relaxed. "I'm sorry," she said. "For what?" "For the way you were treated, for being turned away." He gave a small, gentle smile. "I'm used to it." The words broke something inside her. Patricia wrapped each hand carefully, securing clean dressings, making sure they weren't too tight. Her movements were practiced, but her heart pounded. She realized suddenly how intimate this moment was. A tired nurse, a wounded stranger, a quiet room at the far end of a hospital. No one else was watching. "I need you to promise me something," she said, as she finished. "You have to see a doctor tomorrow. These wounds need proper treatment." "I will," he said. She wasn't sure why, but something in his tone told her that promise didn't mean what she thought it did. She removed her gloves and sat back on the small rolling stool, exhaustion crashing over her all at once. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Patricia whispered, almost to herself, "I don't know why I'm doing this." The man tilted his head slightly. "Yes, you do," he said gently. And in that quiet room, with her hand still smelling faintly of antiseptic and blood, Patricia Walker felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not fear, not doubt. Purpose. Patricia noticed it only after she finished securing the final bandage, the way the man's stomach tightened slightly as he shifted on the exam table, the way his eyes followed her movements, not with expectation, but with a quiet awareness. "You haven't eaten," she said. He hesitated, then nodded. "Not today." Something inside her sank. Patricia glanced at the clock on the wall. Nearly 1:30 a.m. She hadn't eaten either, not really, just coffee. Bitter, lukewarm coffee that did nothing but keep her upright. Without thinking too much about it, she stood and walked toward the lockers at the back of the room. "I have something," she said. She opened her bag and pulled out a small paper sack, creased, a little damp from condensation. Inside was a sandwich she had made the morning before, ham and cheese, an apple, a bottle of water. It was all she had brought. She placed the bag gently in his lap. "Please," she said when he started to protest. "Take it." He looked down at the food, then back up at her. "You look exhausted," he said softly. "You need it more than I do." Patricia smiled faintly. "I'll be fine." It wasn't true, but she needed this moment to be true. The man unwrapped the sandwich carefully, his bandaged hands moving awkwardly. He took a small bite, then another, slowly, deliberately, as if each mouthful mattered. "Thank you," he said quietly. "This means more than you know." Patricia watched him eat, a strange warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time that night she felt something other than pressure and fear. She felt right. After a few minutes, he looked up at her again. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course." "Why?" he asked simply. "Why help me?" The question landed heavier than she expected. Patricia sat down on the rolling stool, suddenly aware of how tired she truly was. The walls she had built to keep herself functional, professional, started to crack. She took a breath. "When I became a nurse," she began, choosing her words carefully, "I took an oath. I promised to care for the sick." She paused, her voice tightening. "I didn't promise to care only for the ones who could pay." The man listened without interrupting. "I'm tired," she continued, "tired of a system that makes us choose between compassion and compliance. Tired of watching people suffer because they don't fit into a form or a policy." Her hands trembled as she folded them in her lap. "My husband died suddenly," she said. "My kids live far away now. My mother is slipping away from me. She needs surgery I can't afford." Her voice broke. "I work double shifts. I maxed out my credit cards just trying to keep up, and tonight, after 38 hours without sleep, I was about to stand there and let them turn you away." Tears spilled freely now. "And I realized, if I did that, if I let that happen, then what was the point of any of it?" She wiped her face with the back of her hand, ashamed and relieved all at once. "I needed to help you," she whispered, "because if I didn't, I think I would have lost the last part of myself that still believes this work matters." The room fell silent. The man finished the sandwich and folded the paper carefully, as if treating it with reverence. He drank the water slowly, then looked at Patricia with eyes that seemed impossibly deep. "You chose love," he said, "even when it cost you." Patricia let out a shaky breath. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she admitted. "I don't know how much more I have to give." The man stood carefully, his movement still slow, but steadier now. He placed his bandaged hand gently on her shoulder. "You've already given enough," he said softly. Patricia didn't know why, but at those words she began to cry again, not from despair, but from the quiet, unfamiliar feeling that she was finally seen. The man didn't remove his hand from Patricia's shoulder right away. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes were red and swollen, her breath uneven. She expected sympathy, maybe gratitude. What she saw instead made her heart skip. He was looking at her with a familiarity that felt impossible, not intrusive, not curious, knowing. "Patricia Walker," he said softly. The sound of her full name sent a chill through her body. She hadn't told him, not once. "How do you know my name?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He smiled, not widely, not triumphantly, but with a quiet sadness mixed with warmth. "I know many things," he said. "I know your mother's name is Eleanor. I know she raised you to be strong, even when she was strong herself." Patricia's breath caught. "I know your children live far away," he continued, "and that every night before you sleep, you worry whether they're happy and whether they miss you as much as you miss them." Her legs felt weak. "I know your husband loved you deeply," he said gently, "and that you still talk to him sometimes when the house feels too quiet." Tears streamed freely now. "Who are you?" Patricia whispered. The man's expression softened. "Someone who understands suffering," he said. "Someone who knows what it is to be rejected, ignored, treated as less than human." He stepped closer, both bandaged hands resting lightly on her shoulders now. His touch was careful, almost reverent. "Listen to me," he said. "Your mother will be healed." Patricia shook her head. "You don't understand. The surgery—" "Not the way you expect," he interrupted gently. not through money alone, but she will be restored in a way that will leave doctors without answers. Her heart pounded. Your debts will disappear, he continued, not because you will pay them, but because someone who sees your kindness will choose to lift that burden from you. She couldn't speak. And your exhaustion, he said, his voice steady and sure, will come to an end, because tomorrow everything changes. Patricia's knees nearly gave out. This doesn't make sense, she said. I don't understand. You don't have to, he replied. You only have to trust. He leaned closer, his eyes locking with hers. When you cared for me tonight, he said, you cared for him. The words echoed in the small room. Patricia felt them settle somewhere deep inside her, somewhere beyond logic, beyond reason. She wanted to ask more questions, 100 of them. But the weight of exhaustion pressed down hard now, blurring the edges of the world. Go home, he said softly. Rest. You've done enough. She nodded, still shaking. Thank you, she managed to say. And please see a doctor tomorrow. I will, he replied. But something in his tone told her he didn't mean it the way she thought. As he turned toward the door, Patricia watched him go, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She didn't know it yet, but she had just heard words no ordinary stranger could ever speak, and by morning she would learn how true they were. Patricia didn't sleep when she got home. Her body collapsed onto the bed, but her mind refused to follow. The man's words echoed again and again, looping through her thoughts like a broken recording. Your mother will be healed. Your debts will disappear. Tomorrow, everything changes. When the phone rang at 10:12 a.m., she was barely conscious. Patricia Walker? A woman's voice asked. Yes, she replied groggily. This is hospital administration. We need you to come in immediately. Her stomach dropped. This was it. Someone had reported her. The intake clerk, security, anyone. 30 years of service ended because she helped the wrong person. I'll be there, Patricia said quietly. She showered quickly, changed clothes, and rode the bus back to the hospital in a fog of dread. Every possible outcome played in her mind, none of them good. At 11:00 sharp, she sat across from the hospital's chief operations officer, a neat stack of papers resting on the desk between them. Patricia, the woman began, folding her hands, you're not here to be disciplined. Patricia blinked. I'm not? No, she said slowly. Something unusual has happened. She slid one document forward. This morning, the hospital received a call from a law firm. An anonymous donor has made a financial contribution, specifically designated for you. Patricia stared at the paper. The amount, the woman continued, matches the full cost of your mother's surgery, including all uncovered expenses. The room tilted. There's more, she added. The same donor paid off every outstanding credit card debt in your name, in full. Patricia's breath caught painfully in her chest. And due to your exemplary record, the COO said gently, you've been approved for a promotion, effective immediately, increased salary, better hours, expanded authority. Tears spilled before Patricia could stop them. I don't understand, she whispered. Who did this? The woman shook her head. The donor chose to remain anonymous. Patricia wiped her face and looked up suddenly. The patient, she said. The man I treated last night. Is he okay? The COO frowned slightly. What patient? The man with the hand injuries, Patricia said urgently. He was here around midnight. The woman tapped at her keyboard, scanning records. There's no record of him, she said finally. No admission, no chart, no registration. That's impossible, Patricia insisted. I treated him. I used supplies. The supply usage is logged, the COO said carefully. But there's no patient attached to it. Patricia's heart raced. The security cameras, she said. Check the cameras. Minutes later, they stood watching footage from the hallway. There was Patricia, talking, gesturing, opening doors. But she was alone. No man beside her, no footsteps following, no figure entering or leaving the exam room. Patricia's knees weakened. "I know what I saw," she whispered. "I spoke to him. I touched his hands." The COO's voice softened. "I believe you believe that," she said. "But according to every record we have, that man was never here." Patricia felt a cold shiver run through her entire body. The words returned to her with sudden clarity. "When you cared for me tonight, you cared for him." And for the first time she began to understand. The man hadn't vanished. He had never needed to be recorded at all. Patricia left the administration office in a daze. The hospital hallway felt different now, longer somehow, quieter. Nurses passed her, greeting her as they always had, unaware that the world she knew had just tilted on its axis. A man who never existed, money that appeared overnight, words that now made terrifying sense. She didn't know where her feet were taking her until she realized she was standing at the far end of the emergency wing, outside the small exam room she hadn't used in years, the room where it had happened. Her hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment. What am I hoping to find, she wondered. Proof? Reassurance? Or confirmation that she was losing her mind? She opened the door. The room was quiet and ordinary. The exam table stood where it always had. The rolling stool, the sink, the supply cabinet, no blood. No discarded bandages, no trace of the 3 hours she had spent there the night before. Patricia stepped inside slowly. She approached the exam table, running her fingers along the edge of the vinyl mattress, half expecting it to feel different. It didn't. And then she saw it. At the center of the table, right where the man had sat, was a small object she knew hadn't been there before. A wooden horse. It was no bigger than her hand, carved with extraordinary detail. Every muscle was defined, the curve of the neck, the lines of the mane, the eyes, strangely expressive, as if the figure were quietly aware of being seen. Patricia picked it up with trembling fingers. The wood felt old, smooth, warm somehow. Not like something recently made, but like something that had been held for generations. There were no markings, no signature, no explanation, just the horse. "Why?" she whispered into the empty room. Why a horse? It made no sense, and yet something about it felt deliberate, intentional, as if it had been left not as evidence, but as a reminder. Patricia sat down on the rolling stool and pressed the small carving against her chest. Tears came again, not sharp this time, not panicked. Quiet tears. Because she understood one thing now with absolute certainty. She had not imagined that night. She had not been alone. And even if the cameras denied it, even if the records erased it, something sacred had passed through that room. And it had left a sign behind, not to be explained, but to be remembered. The surgery was scheduled for the following Monday. Patricia barely remembered the days leading up to it. Everything moved in a blur. Phone calls, paperwork, signatures, confirmations that still felt unreal. The money was there. The bills were paid. The numbers checked out every time she looked. But fear didn't disappear just because the impossible had already happened once. On the morning of the surgery, Patricia sat alone in the hospital waiting room, the wooden horse tucked carefully inside her bag. She didn't take it out. She didn't need to. Just knowing it was there was enough. The operation lasted nearly 6 hours. 6 hours of pacing, 6 hours of praying without words, 6 hours of staring at a closed operating room door and wondering how many more times her heart could survive this kind of waiting. When the surgeon finally emerged, his mask pulled down around his neck, Patricia was on her feet before he could even speak. "The surgery was successful," he said. "We removed the clot completely. There were no complications." Her knees nearly buckled with relief. But the real miracle hadn't happened yet. An hour later, Patricia was allowed into recovery. Her mother lay still beneath thin blankets, tubes, and monitors surrounding her. Patricia took her hand gently, afraid to wake her, afraid of what might happen when she did. When Eleanor finally opened her eyes, confusion flickered for just a moment. Then, clarity. Patricia?" she said softly. Patricia's breath caught. "Yes, Mom," she whispered. "It's me." Eleanor's eyes focused fully now. Recognition settled in like a sunrise. "My sweet girl," she said. "Why are you crying?" Patricia laughed and sobbed at the same time. "You know who I am?" she asked. "Of course I do," Eleanor replied. "You're my daughter." In the days that followed, doctors ran test after test. They reviewed scans, compared images, consulted colleagues, and each time the same conclusion surfaced, quietly, cautiously. The clot was gone. But more than that, the areas of the brain previously affected by Alzheimer's showed no signs of progression. In fact, some appeared restored. "This doesn't happen," one neurologist admitted. "Not like this." Eleanor remembered names, dates, stories from years ago. She cooked again, laughed again, slept through the night. It was as if the fog had lifted. When Patricia finally asked the surgeon how he explained it, he didn't hesitate long. "Medically," he said, "I can't." Then, after a pause, he added softly, "Some things fall outside our charts." That night, back home, Patricia placed the wooden horse on the small shelf in her living room. She stood there for a long time, staring at it. The man's words returned to her once more. "Your mother will be healed, not the way you expect." For the first time, Patricia allowed herself to believe something she had been trained her whole life to question: that healing doesn't always follow rules, and miracles don't always ask permission. 2 months passed. Life didn't return to what it had been before that night in the emergency room. It moved forward into something entirely new. Patricia Walker was still an ER nurse, still worked nights, still wore the same scrubs. But something in her had shifted. As the new night shift supervisor, Patricia now had the authority she'd never had before, the ability to slow things down just enough to ask a different question. Not, "Can you pay?" but "How can we help?" It started quietly. A man with chest pain and no insurance, admitted anyway. A young woman with severe abdominal pain and no ID, treated first, paperwork later. A homeless veteran with infected wounds, no longer turned away. Patricia worked with social workers, charity care programs, and hospital foundations. She fought where she could, compromised where she had to, and somehow the hospital noticed. Community partners stepped in, donations appeared. The ER received recognition for compassionate care. The system didn't collapse as so many feared, it softened. At home, Eleanor moved through the house like herself again. She cooked, she cleaned. She told stories Patricia hadn't heard in years. They sat together in the evenings, drinking tea, laughing softly at old memories that had almost been lost forever. One night, Eleanor picked up the wooden horse from the shelf and turned it over slowly in her hands. "You still don't know what it means, do you?" she asked. Patricia smiled. "Not really." Eleanor thought for a moment. "Horses carry people," she said. "They move us from one place to another. Maybe it's not about where it came from. Maybe it's about where it took you." Patricia felt tears rise, not from pain but from understanding. She had been carried, from despair to hope, from exhaustion to rest, from fear to faith. The horse went back on the shelf, still a mystery, and that was okay, because some things aren't meant to be explained, only remembered. Late one February night, the ER doors opened again. A young woman was rushed in, doubled over in pain, acute appendicitis, no insurance, no time. The intake clerk hesitated. Patricia stepped forward. "Admit her," she said calmly. "We'll figure out the rest later." The surgery saved the woman's life. When she woke up, crying in relief, she asked Patricia the same question the wounded man once had. "Why would you help me when I couldn't pay?" Patricia smiled, softly this time. "Because someone once taught me that human lives are worth more than paperwork," she said, "and that when we care for the most vulnerable, we're never really alone." The woman didn't fully understand, But someday, Patricia believed she would, because that was how miracles worked. They didn't end with the person who received them. They moved outward, quietly, patiently, one act of compassion at a time. And somewhere, perhaps unseen, perhaps unrecorded, grace kept walking among them. Before we close, let me ask you something. Have you ever experienced a moment you couldn't fully explain, but you knew deep in your heart it was sacred? A person who appeared at just the right time, a door that opened when everything felt closed, a kindness that changed you forever. If this story spoke to you, share it with someone who needs hope tonight. And if you believe that faith still walks among us in unexpected ways, subscribe to Heaven Walks with Us. Because sometimes the miracles we're waiting for are waiting for us to choose compassion first. Amen.